was just actually commenting to Dawn that I left the organization that became Department of Finance and Services back in 2004 and joined Microsoft. Back at that time, it's interesting that Treasurer Peter Costello implored us to spur the economy of Australia by having one child for mum, one child for dad, and one child for the country. I had my first child in 2004. I've since completed my duty for Australia. 12 years later, we're now implored by our current Prime Minister, Turnbull, to instead innovate rather than procreate. Both are fun. They're not mutually exclusive. Sadly, both of them are a little more likely when you're younger. This compulsion to innovate has become the driving theme of this year, to build innovative businesses, to transform digital government. But to get there, we need to have quite a hard look at where we are right now. This graph that I'll show you now in a second indicates the number of innovative enterprises that are collaborating with businesses, or collaborating with government and education in Australia. It's quite a stark graph. Australia, if you can see down the bottom right corner, is the very worst performer on this chart. And so it's hardly surprising that if we're trying to drive innovation, we have to have a hard conversation about changing the relationship between government and businesses and higher education. And I would argue that we have to have just as similar a hard look at how we currently practice security and privacy and reframe our approach to enable digital transformation. This is my last speech as National Security Officer for Microsoft Australia. Over the past 5 years, I've worked with many talented people in government, in enterprises, in small businesses, as they work to protect their organizations from insider and external threats. I've led our work on security assurance as we launched 3 of our cloud services into Australia over the last year and a half. And in those 5 years, I developed what I would describe as a security mindset. And it's a mindset that focuses on threat, on risk, and on vulnerability, how capabilities are broken rather than built. Now, this security mindset is a very real attribute of security professionals. It develops from an awareness of threats, from an appreciation that many people aren't aware of those threats, from being surrounded by people with similar perspectives. It's not irrational. It's not unfounded. It's quite necessary. But if it's unchecked, it can develop into something that's quite damaging. It can turn into a fixed security mindset, a mindset where the need for security outweighs every other consideration, hampering risk-taking, stifling innovation, overexerting control, and minimizing change. Information security professionals who have a fixed security mindset have lost sight of their real purpose. Security shouldn't be about implementing rigid draconian controls. It shouldn't make your job harder. Nor should it be about implementing what Bruce Schneier eloquently describes as security theater. But frequently, it has actually become that way. In the worst cases, a fixed security mindset effectively handcuffs its organizations, their ability to innovate, to adapt, to react, and to respond to both threats and opportunities. At best, it applies controls that are heavy-handed and often exceed what is actually required. Inordinate amounts of quite limited resources are being spent on what is tantamount to a shotgun blast, hoping that one of the pellets hits these fast-moving targets. I'll tell you a story from when I was a kid. When I was a 50-year-old kid growing up in Ireland, I used to be sent to Céilís. Now, Céilí is an Irish dance, and at an Irish dance, 15-year-old boys would all line up across one wall, and all the girls would line up on the other wall. The music would start, and not one of us would move. We'd be terrified, stuck to the ground, in fear that we would cross the chasm and talk to the girls. The only thing that would break that impasse was when a teacher would grab one of the boys by the ear, bring them to the middle of the floor, introduce them to one of the girls, and they'd start their dance. That's when the music actually really began, when our hormones kicked in and we started the dance. I see the same kind of difficulty between the security organization and the business organization of organizations. They're not dancing. And the reality is that this fixed security mindset has emerged in many organizations, and it causes that separation between security and the business. But how does it happen, and how can it be addressed? I personally think that one of the critical elements that's missing in those kind of organizations is an appreciation of the strategic intent. Not understanding the strategic intent of the business leads to quite a tactical focus. Organizations want to drive new value through innovation, and the role of a security function is to enable that innovation safely. Second thing I think is that organizations struggle to find a proper framework to balance governance, risk, compliance, threats, vulnerabilities. They look to establish risk management processes, but they all too often devolve into quite threat-driven reactionary processes, or into compliance-driven tick-the-box exercises. Locally here in Canberra, we have incongruent policies that advocate both very rigid compliance adherence and risk-based approaches at the same time in the same documents. It is hardly surprising that enterprises and government organizations struggle to find the right balance between them. And thirdly, and I think this is one of the most damaging aspects of a fixed security mindset, is the quest for uniformity, consistency, and control. The desirability of a one-size-fits-all approach. It is a myth that uniformity is possible. An organization that is truly innovating is not uniform, and applying security controls in a uniform way is just debilitating and restrictive. If we are to enable innovation, I think this gap, this chasm between business and security needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed by dealing with this fixed security mindset. But to get a little deeper into that and how that might be managed, I think we have to recognize the truth of the relationship between business and security people. Information security people are agents of stability by their very nature, whereas business people try to drive towards change and innovation. While security might try to be in the business of control, the business is in the pursuit of change. At a technology level, security professionals, they're led by a cohesive security architecture. That's their guideposts. But a business looks to its overarching business objectives, its overarching intent and governance. And these two forces need to be reconciled towards the meaningful change, being control of that change and understanding why those changes need to come into place. I want to talk about a few specifics here in Australian government and with many of the organizations in this room either working with government or enterprises or organizations within government. I want to put together a few scenarios that can help bring this back together. But first of all, I'll talk about what happens when information security and strategic intent get misaligned. And I'll give you a personal story. This was an app, a prototype that we developed for an emergency response organization. This was a few years ago. You can see Tidbinbilla, you can see ACT in that. It wasn't for them, so I've changed that to protect the guilty. This was an app that we put together as a prototype where people in the event of a bushfire emergency could see data that came from cloud services, from dispatch systems overlaid together on any mobile device. They could get instant access to the information. They could go through Skype and actually start connecting to a volunteer who would help them develop a bushfire emergency plan. We got it to a prototype stage, and it didn't go any further. Now, we've all got apps that we think would be world-changing. We've all got ideas that we'd love to say, I don't know if this would have worked or not. But what I can say is that it was stalled on one particular thing, was concerns around security and privacy for the use of offshore cloud services. That stopped this project. And it's unfortunate that in an event soon afterwards where there was a bushfire emergency, and that organization who was still using quite capacity-constrained local hosting couldn't serve the demand for their information and ended up having to display this bottom message on their website. We can't deal with the capacity, so turn to Twitter, a global cloud service, as their only way to get the information out there. It's ironic. Some years later, we've actually made a huge amount of progress, and volunteers in emergency services all across Australia, in Victoria, New South Wales, in South Australia, with Queensland Police, they use Microsoft cloud services to coordinate their activity in the event of an emergency. They share information, they coordinate actions, they publish real-time information to the community, and it's all based on cloud services. To me, that's moving beyond a fixed security mindset and learning to innovate with real intent. But I want to talk to those steps around how we can change this, how we can actually go past this fixed security mindset. I want to suggest 5 steps. The first of which really relates to building an information security posture around resilience. This has come up a couple of times this morning already. This here is the model that we use within Microsoft, the concept of protect, detect, respond. 3 pillars that are tailored to the assets that we actually protect. It is absolutely not one size fits all, entirely tailored. And that tailoring is the most critical aspect of how we manage our information security. So to translate this to a local example, many of you will be familiar with the Australian Signals Directorate Top 35 mitigations. I was once a really big fan of the Top 35 mitigations. And when they were launched in 2011, they garnered a lot of attention and support, quite deservedly were recognized as being a leading practice. Unfortunately, a few things happened afterwards. And I want to walk you through what happened. Firstly, the list changed. And the list changed to put a technical control called application whitelisting at the very top of the list. And other controls that relate more to user education, user engagement, participation in the security process, they got relegated to the bottom of the list, kind of like my Premier League team getting pushed down to Division 1. They were abandoned after a bad season. The challenge is that technical control, application whitelisting, it's a very specific control that prevents any applications, any processes that are not explicitly authorized on a system to actually run on that system. And that particular technical control, for practical reasons, forces almost uniformity and consistency across those systems. It's a technical control that drives towards uniformity. The third thing that happened, I think, the next thing that happened, I think, was more dangerous. This specific technical control became a mandatory requirement across all of Australian government agencies, regardless of their context, regardless of the threat, regardless of their scenario. It became a mandatory requirement. It then became a requirement that had to be reported on at the secretary level. It then became an audit requirement that the Australian National Audit Office reported on. A growth hacking idea, the idea of responding to advanced persistent threats in a very flexible, agile way, turned into a curmudgeon of compliance. And it became a tool of a fixed security mindset. And I struggle with that concept because I think our best security practices come when we don't apply uniformity, when we adapt to the circumstances and the threats. And so when uniformity is strictly and dramatically and mandatory enforced, it becomes a tool of restriction. It becomes a barrier to innovation. But building a secure or resilient posture is not just about picking the right technical controls to that concept. More importantly, it's about building capability, building people in the right way. Which really comes to my second point, which is rethinking how we deal with data and how we protect data. The question came up earlier, how do we think about security when data is flowing everywhere? Maybe our security models are broken. And I would argue that they are absolutely broken. Our security posture, our mechanisms for control of security are broken. Our current security paradigm is based on a model that is very much influenced by the concept of documents having very defined owners and formal classifications. Those documents are held in folders or containers and are segregated from one another. That's the core concept of our security operating model. Ownership, classification, segregation. And that model is then embedded in the personal security, the physical security, the information security practices that are common across this environment, across government, across enterprises. And then as networks, as applications, as databases have evolved, we've tried to pull that model and change that model. We've morphed it, but we've stretched it to breaking point and beyond. See, now small elements of data flow from sensors. They flow from sensors into cloud services where they're aggregated, where they're analyzed, where insights are developed. Those insights are then sent out to applications running on devices that cache some of the data. And then that data is then shared with other applications and uploaded to cloud services and moved on and on. Data is far more atomic. It's the concept of documents having defined owners and defined classifications. It just doesn't work anymore. It just doesn't work. And some of the technical controls that have emerged since around policy-enforced encryption or continuous monitoring techniques or big data analytics or encryption, these can work. These can be effective in part, but they're only in part. They're only a Band-Aid. The patient's bleeding out, and another Band-Aid is not going to fix this. This isn't about another technical control to overlay. Our model's been smashed, and we need to front up to that and change our model. I would argue that we need to do away with some concepts. We need to do away with the concept of network and physical segregation as being relevant for information security in a modern system. We need to do away with the model that places firewalls and network devices at a perimeter and believe that they will keep us safe when the internal network is laid bare. I think we need to place controls on the data, controls that move with the data and are enforced wherever that data is. However it is disassembled, reaggregated, we need controls that protect the data as it flows. And if we're going to do that, we need standards, and we need global standards. This graph is the internet population 5 years ago today and through to 2020. Australia had a big influence on the internet population prior to 2000. And I look at this chart in two ways. On the one hand, we have to recognize that we are now just under 2% of the internet population. So our influence is limited. But when we target that influence, we can do great things. The Australian government, through the CSIRO, invented Wi-Fi, the capability that now powers all of modern computing, modern mobile computing, was invented here by the CSIRO. Our 2% influence can have dramatic impact if we target it well. On the other hand, I see 98% of the innovation potential outside of our country. I see 98% of the users out there. And that innovation can be leveraged here. It can be brought here. We can take advantage of the technologies and the talent and the services that exist overseas. But way too often, we defer to local standards, to local policies, to local practices, to local restrictions. And we limit ourselves from the 98% of innovation that is out there that we need to bring here. I would argue that we need to be part of that global economy. We need to open ourselves up to all of that innovation, not just so that we can leverage it, but also so that our organizations, our businesses, can compete on that global stage. Again, to make a specific scenario here locally, during 2014, we took all of our cloud services through an IRAP assessment. So if you're familiar with an IRAP assessment, it's the formal assessment of security according to federal government standards. We were the first public cloud provider to do so. It took about 4 months for the first service, Microsoft Azure. And it wasn't expensive, it was an arduous process. We subsequently took Office 365, CRM Online through the same kind of process. And in April last year, when the Australian Signals Directorate created the Certified Cloud Services list, effectively creating a list of approved cloud services, we were on that list. There were 3 services on that list, and Microsoft had 2 of them. Now, it's almost a year since that day, and there are now only 7 services on that list, and 3 of them belong to Microsoft. It's only 7. There are literally thousands of domestic and international cloud services and application vendors who just cannot afford to undertake the process that we undertook. The process we undertook effectively made almost no security changes to our engineering practices. It was simply a process of working through in a due diligent way. Now, it was a useful thing to do, but it didn't necessarily add value. I want to be clear. The bridging process that the Australian Signals Directorate and the Australian Government put in place with the cloud certified list was a great step. It was a really, really good step to put that in place. It clarified a lot of confusion. It enabled a way forward. It was a recognition of the change that needs to happen. But I would argue it needs to go way beyond that. We need to open it up to far more cloud services, far more innovation. To do that, I would suggest that we actually change some of the model. And instead of requiring IRAPA processes, instead of requiring local standards, we lean on global standards. We lean on ISO standards and SOC standards, and we use them to bring that innovation here in a safe way. To me, that would unleash a wave of innovation across government that would really allow us to move forward in a safe way. And I would say that if the global standards aren't sufficient, if we have concerns about whether they're appropriate or not, then it's on us to use our 2% influence to make them better and improve them. This global focus needs to also move to privacy protection. So many times I encounter the refrain that, we'd love to innovate, but the cloud services need to be here in Australia. And the justification behind that is commonly privacy obligations mandated by the Privacy Act, or a desire to only have the highest level of privacy protections that can only be afforded by Australia as a jurisdiction. Now, as my college professor used to say to me when I came with quite a poorly structured argument, he would say, not only is that not right, it's not even wrong. The fact is that with adequate contractual protections, with adequate due diligence, with contractual controls in place, with risk management practices, the Privacy Act makes no such prohibition. It doesn't. And as this chart from DLA Piper, a legal firm in Sydney, shows, Australia doesn't afford the highest legal and jurisdictional protections. That actually belongs to Europe and other countries like Hong Kong. So I think we need to move beyond this. Thousands of our partners, lots of other cloud service providers, lots of innovation exists around the world, and we have to open ourselves up to that. We need to not only take advantage of that innovation, we need to compete on an equal footing with that innovation if we're going to play our role into the future. So if those are the 4 steps, I want to leave you with the last. This one gets us all the way, which is really about replacing this fixed security mindset with a growth mindset. So to explain the difference, a fixed security mindset assumes that our capability, our creative abilities are static givens. They're limited. We can't change them in any meaningful way. Striving for success, avoiding failure at all costs, they're the indicators of a fixed mindset. But a growth mindset, on the other hand, it thrives on challenge. It sees these kind of challenges as not as evidence of deficiency, but as a springboard on which we can grow and we can evolve and we can innovate. I actually believe that these 2 mindsets drive our behavior as individuals, as organizations, as a nation. And I'm really quite optimistic that we can develop that growth mindset. We can progress forward. We can overcome this fixed security mindset, and that will enable us to drive forward and enable and accelerate the innovation that we're all striving towards. Thank you very much.
Hi, Rizwan from ESEF Systems. If I just put one word to your presentation, basically you're saying that eventually the core for security will be that you have to secure information at the source, which is the data itself. So the boundaries have finished, files have diminished, and basically parameter defenses are finished as well. So you talked about standard. Is there one standard which you can relate to when you talk about securing information at the source?
Yeah, so there are lots of standards, obviously, as you know, but I mean, I think some of the critical ones are around the ISO 27 series, and recognizing that we have standards that go from 27.1, which is basic information security, up to 27.18 around privacy, 27.17 around cloud security, 35 up into healthcare standards. We need to lean on those. They actually do describe how to manage information more effectively and to manage the data security more than just the broader sense of network security. The problem is, I think we don't use them enough, and we don't contribute to them, we don't participate in those processes. And so we think that we have to invent them again. They're not complete. You know, some new standards are only just emerging. They're not perfect, but we need to play a role in actually developing them rather than waiting. I wouldn't necessarily say it's always about the data at the source, because sometimes it's about capturing the data as it moves, understanding, analyzing data as it's processed, and deciding how to act on it. It's not always at the source, but there are models around where it can be done as it flows across an environment.
Hi, James. Thanks for that. Had a bit of humour in it as well. A bit of Irish humour. Good on you. James, a quick question. I was going to ask it earlier, but didn't get the opportunity, but now seems as good a time as ever. I'm wondering if what you were saying is, when you think about the fact that we've got an always-on, interconnected, ubiquitous, global environment, is unilateral privacy and security policy really going to get any country anywhere?
So let me just clarify what you're asking. Can any country go it alone on privacy status?
Yeah.
No, I don't believe so. I don't believe it can work in privacy and security in any approach where a country is trying to mandate or drive forward independently of others. You know, we see that even when the best protections in place are in Europe. It's not a single country in Europe. It's lots of others. We see it across Asia Pacific. And sometimes the leadership might come from a country like, let's say, Hong Kong. You might not suspect it would come from there. But Hong Kong's leading the way, has led the way in some of their privacy protections. So countries will lead the way, but then we have to do it in collaboration with others. We have to lean on those standards. You know, and we do have many, many countries with different privacy standards. But then things like ISO 27.18 has come along as a globally endorsed standard for privacy protections of cloud services. Yet only a handful of cloud services will say that they've actually implemented those and can stand behind them. So it's when I talk, it's not just about the nations and their actions, but also about cloud providers and industry participants for us to follow up on that and follow them.
Right, we better wrap up. So thank you very much.